Welcome to Editing Humanities, where we explore the space where science and human experience collide. I'm Landon, and today we're opening the door to a conversation that sits at the intersection of medicine, technology, ethics, and emotional resilience. We will touch base on reproductive health, IVF, and the emerging world of gene editing. For many people, the path to parenthood is far from straightforward. IVF offers hope, but it also brings with it a series of deeply emotional experiences. Hope and heartbreak often walk hand in hand in fertility clinics. The journey can involve physical tolls, financial stress, relationship strain, and mental health challenges that aren't always talked about as openly as they should be. In today's episode, we'll be talking with a mental health professional who works with individuals and couples going through this process. We'll hear what it's really like, emotionally and psychologically, to support someone navigating fertility treatments. What kinds of emotional surface when clients confront failed cycles? How do they cope with decisions like selecting a donor or discarding embryos that didn't implant? These are intimate moments filled with uncertainty, grief, guilt, and sometimes unexpected joy. But this episode goes a step further. We're also stepping into the future. As the scientific community continues to push the boundaries of reproductive technology, a new frontier is rapidly approaching: gene editing, most notably with tools like CRISPR. It's one thing to help someone conceive. It's another to give them the power to change the genetic blueprint of their future child. CRISPR is already being explored for medical use, correcting genetic disorders or preventing inherited diseases. But what happens when this technology moves beyond treating illness and starts edging into enhancement or design? What does it mean for our sense of identity, for parents' expectations, for a child's autonomy? And what are the emotional consequences of entering a world where we can pick and choose traits? In today's conversation, we'll explore the emotional challenges IVF patients face and how mental health supports can make a difference. Whether clients are already expressing fears, curiosity, or ethical concerns around gene editing, how emotional stakes change when we move from conception to modification, and what role therapists might play as our society confronts increasingly complex choices about the future of reproduction.
Today I'm with Brittany Larson, and we will be going over the ethics of CRISPR and how IVF is compared. Brittany, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Landon. Thanks for having me. So, my name is Brittany Larson, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in Arizona. I currently work for my own private practice and work with many women and couples who are facing IVF treatments.
Awesome. I just want to go and ask you a couple questions right now. To start off, can you share what it was like working with a client going through IVF and what kinds of emotional or physical challenges they face?
Oh, absolutely. Many of my clients in my practice are going through IVF or have previously been through IVF. Um, they often come to therapy just seeking a lot of like an emotional support for like anxiety and depression, often a lot of things that they face as they're going through IVF. Um, Along with that, they experience a lot of like grief and loss. So there's plethora of emotions that often couples and these women are faced with as they're trying to work through IVF.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a lot at your work. So, in your experience, what kind of support do IVF patients typically need for a mental health perspective?
Landon, I'm so glad you were bringing this question up. So, there are still many people who are going through IVF or have faced it in the past that often struggle with reaching out for help. So, in my experience, many of the clients that I'm working with, they often are looking for ways to help manage all the uncertainty, anxiety, and sadness that comes along with IVF. They struggle, oftentimes I'll get them like early stages, as they're just starting and navigating this process. And there's a lot of um, definite like stigmas that they often face. So, like with their family and things like that. So they're really trying to navigate these difficult experiences, and often reach out needing support to really just navigate from the very beginning to the end.
Absolutely. I just wanted to kind of go over and compare IVF and CRISPR. Is it okay if I ask you a few more questions?
Oh, absolutely.
So, with the growing conversation around CRISPR and gene editing, how do you see the ethical or emotional considerations differing from those in IVF?
That is a really great question. So, what I'm often hearing and seeing with the idea of like gene editing is really the act of people kind of playing God and what the long-term impacts would be. There are some ethical and moral things that often come up, for future generations that maybe come from CRISPR or gene editing. They don't often have the consent to, for future generations. So what you see a lot of in IVF is already the emotional stress that infertility does take on a person, with starting out from someone that's maybe struggling with infertility and who has gone through many steps to try to have a child of their own, coming to IVF. And, sometimes there is some good things that come from it, and sometimes there's some loss. So there's a lot of stress and emotional stress that is surrounded by the repeated cycles of IVF. Along with that, there are a lot of, people often other, excuse me, I'm so sorry. For ethical considerations when looking at gene editing is, the increased emotional weight that also comes from that, not only IVF, but deciding on how to alter a child's genetic makeup and what that would look like, and if there are consequences or uncertainties that may be surrounding that, and how that will affect, our future generation.
Absolutely. With all the ethical dilemmas, what do you think professionals should do to limit all the dilemmas considering CRISPR and IVF?
I think that out of all the ethical dilemmas, the main priority should be the safety and well-being of the person, our future generation, and the baby. I think that oftentimes questions come up for many clients who are hesitant when even exploring the idea of gene editing is, are we crossing a line here? What if something goes wrong? Will my child be healthy? How will this affect the child 10 years down the road? And I think in order to avoid a lot of these ethical dilemmas, there has to be an increased awareness and education surrounding CRISPR and IVF. Good.
Do clients ever express concerns or curiosity about gene editing when discussing IVF or fertility treatments in general?
A lot of the curiosity has come up regarding gene editing. There's not a lot of information out there that's reaching many of the people with IVF, but they do often raise many questions of curiosity, like, if I had this ability to fix this gene or edit this gene, would my child have less risks of any, diseases, in the future? They often bring up a lot of questions about, if this was a possibility, um, and my child or embryo, I should say, ended up with a hereditary disease, they will often, wonder like, could this just be edited out? So there's many, many times that the idea of gene editing has come up with clients who just really feel like it gives them a little bit of hope and optimism. But there's often, that subconscious part of them that often questions whether, this would even be a good thing.
What about concerns?
I'm glad you brought that up too, because I know we were just discussing the curiosity, but there's also concerns as well. Honestly, many people will kind of question too, just exactly what we're talking about today, the ethical dilemma surrounding it. They often ask themselves, like, are we crossing a line? What is this? What would this even look like 10 years from now? Is this um, embryo still my embryo, even though it may, you know, genes may have been edited. They often bring up concerns around safety, like what happens if something goes wrong with the edit? What will happen then? Will the embryo and the future generation or child be faced with more health issues and more risks than if gene editing never occurred? There's a lot of many too, like moral and spiritual implications that people discuss about. Um, you know, Oftentimes people have brought up, maybe they are quite religious or just kind of have this moral compass, which kind of prevents them for even thinking about whether gene editing would be an appropriate method for their experience with IVF.
How do you think the potential use of CRISPR for designing future children might affect parents' mental health or expectations in a way that IVF might not?
I think that is a great question. I think that the use of CRISPR in designing like our future generation and future children really may affect a parent's like mental health or expectations in a way that maybe IVF would not. A lot of times with IVF, you're able to choose certain genetic components, from the donor along with the mother's side. And that gives them a sense of being able to kind of already slightly choose some qualities that they would like to see in their future child. But with CRISPR, I think that with the gene editing and being able to take away or add certain genetic components to children often will leave many parents with unrealistic expectations, possibly. There's already this idea that many of these couples and mothers face that um, already feel like really high expectations after most often than not suffering losses. So, with their expectations, they may experience more emotional distress, stress, anxiety, even depression, and losing hope if the idea of what they wish they could have didn't always work out, which can leave a lot of disappointment in some and even some grief.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that. I also want to dive in more into the emotional side of CRISPR and IVF. One question I did want to ask is how IVF often involves tough choices like discarding embryos or choosing donors. What kinds of ethical dilemmas do clients share with you, and how do you help them process those?
Well, that's a really great question. So, oftentimes when families are coming to me for, IVF, they're experiencing a huge emotional roller coaster, from things of initially having some hope to sometimes disappointment, discouragement, anticipation. They experience a wide range of emotions. And many oftentimes, these people are faced with more cycles of IVF, which honestly leads to a lot of intensity in their emotional strain and increased stress day to day.
How do you think the emotional stakes change when science starts moving from helping people conceive to altering the genes of future children?
The emotional stakes. when science starts moving from helping people conceive to altering the genes of future children, I think that it often kind of goes back to like hope and responsibility. Assisted reproduction, IVF is really founded a lot on hope for the couple, hope for the family, hope for the child. And with genetic editing, it often has a sense of like moral weight and responsibility. Um, we're not just helping nature along, we are actually like making choices that truly can affect the identity and the life of that child, along with like the family who raises them. And to add to that, there can be this huge, responsibility, and it can be emotionally heavy of just constant questioning of what if we choose wrong? What if these choices that we make affect that kind of affect like unrealistic expectations? Um, I think that oftentimes CRISPR and gene editing can create a sense of like re- regret or perfectionism. And this can carry a lot of pressure and stress for that person and the family and society.
Absolutely. I just had one question. What role do you think therapists should play in the future of reproductive technology like CRISPR?
I think that the most important things for therapists, especially therapists, um, working with a specific population for the future of reproduction is to really learn to provide a true safe space for individuals because with CRISPR influencing our reproductive like technology, there's this emotional complexity of decisions and what gene editing could do for the individual. I think it's very important for the therapist to really help a client like unpack hopes, fears, pressures, anything influencing like those decisions, and really being able to help them navigate these ethical dilemmas because in many important cases, there's really no clear medical indication of the line between, making these hard decisions. Going back to the ethical dilemmas, there are a lot of like ethical tensions that often many of our clients will be faced with, like what are the implications of siblings or society and how people view them and view their family. I think it's important for therapists to gain a lot of education and knowledge on how to navigate, these families, like, looking at like long term, like what if one sibling had a gene edit and the other one didn't, or how do we explain the child's origin? I think it's important to really be able to collaborate with reproductive ethics team if we are working with more people in the future who are dealing with CRISPR.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for stopping by and answering a few questions about CRISPR and IVF. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Lennon. Thanks for letting me share my experiences.
That brings us to the end of our conversation today, one that explored not just the science of assisted reproduction, but the intimate, often invisible emotional world that surrounds it. What we've heard today is that IVF and the wider world of fertility treatment is far more than a series of medical appointments or biological procedures. It's a deeply personal and emotional journey, one that raises complex questions about identity, worth, hope, and heartbreak. For many people, this path is filled with uncertainty, with decisions that don't come with clear instructions and outcomes that can shift from joy to devastation, sometimes within the span of a single phone call. It's about trying again and again through cycles that are not just physically exhausting, but mentally and emotionally draining. It's about dealing with loss that's hard to name, let alone share. It's about navigating relationships under strain, maintaining a sense of self, and clinging to hope even when the future feels impossibly fragile. And as we turn our gaze towards the future, toward gene editing, embryo selection, and rapidly evolving reproductive technologies, the questions only grow more layered. Technologies like CRISPR bring with them extraordinary possibilities, but also immense ethical weight. If IVF was once considered revolutionary, what do we call the ability to alter the genetic makeup of future generations? And what does it mean, emotionally, socially, morally, to step into that kind of power? What responsibilities will come with those choices? What new pressures might parents face, not just to conceive, but to optimize, to select traits, to eliminate risk, to perfect what it means to be human? And how do we carry the emotional consequences of those decisions, especially when outcomes don't go as planned? This is where mental health professionals play an essential role, not just now, but increasingly in the years to come. The work isn't simply about helping people deal with fertility challenges, it's about walking alongside them through some of the life's most tender and ambiguous moments. It's about listening without judgment, making space for grief that society doesn't always recognize, and helping people sit with questions that don't have easy answers. They are the ones helping clients grieve embryos they never got to hold. They are there after failed transfers in the quiet rooms where there are no more options. They are supporting people through the ethical complexities of using donor eggs or sperm, of gestational carriers, of surrogacy, of talking to children about how they come into the world. They're exploring what it means to consider, one day, selecting a child's eye color or intelligence or resistance to disease. And they're helping people find their way back to themselves when the road to parenthood takes unexpected turns. But this isn't about individual therapy or private grief. This is a conversation that demands a collective response. It's about how we as society hold space for these experiences. It's about how we train our clinicians, how we write our policies, how we fund our research, and how we speak publicly and privately about reproductive challenges and choices. It's about making sure that as science accelerates, empathy keeps pace. As technology becomes more precise, our care becomes more compassionate. And that as we gain more control over life before birth, we don't lose sight of the humanity that exists within every choice, every story, and every person who's walked this path. Thank you for spending this time with us. Conversations like this are how we start to build a more compassionate, thoughtful future, one where science and soul can coexist. And as always, keep asking the big picture, because that's where the most meaningful conversations begin. Until next time, I'm Landon, and this has been Editing Humanities.